Adam, how did you first get involved in solving crises around the world?
I don't really solve crises, but I have been involved in helping people who are trying to solve crises in a lot of places. I got involved for the first time in 1991. I was working at Shell in London using a particular approach to thinking about the future, which is scenario thinking. And there were some leaders in South Africa that wanted to use that particular method to think about the transition away from apartheid. And that was my first experience, and it was wonderful, and I've been doing it ever since.
What is scenario thinking?
Well, scenario thinking just means thinking about what might happen. What might happen, thinking in a structured, disciplined way about what's possible in the future. And that's not the same as trying to predict what will happen, and it's not the same as what you want to happen. And it turns out this very simple thing of talking in a structured, reasoned way about what's possible here, what might happen, what would it mean, and what should we do about it, a lot can come from that kind of conversation. The big discovery in South Africa is that what's particularly interesting is to have that kind of conversation not only among experts or academics, but amongst the stakeholder leaders themselves. That was the big discovery of that first process in South Africa in 1991.
Can you please tell us a little bit more about how you apply scenario thinking to the South African situation?
Well, the South African situation, after the legalization of the opposition parties and the release of the prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, was very confused, very chaotic, very conflictual. We all remember how it ended in 1994, but the period before that was not only confusing but frightening. Nobody knew what was going to happen. There were assassinations, there were negotiations, then negotiation would be off, there'd be riots, and in this context, in this confusing, conflictual, complex context, to have a group of leaders from across all parts of South African society, left, right, opposition, establishment, black, white, meet together and talk together about what's going on here and what might happen and what should we do about it, turned out to be quite helpful. Not the only thing that was going on. There were tens of processes going on, negotiations, forums, working groups, but this was one of the processes, and I think it made a contribution to clarify the thinking, to create some common thinking among people from across the society.
So you get people from different groups to come together and discuss about the future of South Africa. Am I right?
Yeah, that was it. The idea is to get a group, of 20 or 30 people who together can see the whole picture. Somebody said yesterday, who together can see the whole elephant. Everybody's seeing one part of it, but almost nobody's seeing the whole thing. So to get a group of people who together can see the whole situation and who together can understand what's really possible here. Not fantasy, not dreams, not political programs, not nightmares, but what can happen here? What's the map of what could happen? If we head in this direction, what could happen? If we head in that direction, what could happen? That was the essence of how we got started with the work in South Africa.
What was the conclusion after the meeting?
Well, it was a series of meetings. It went on for most of 1991. I think there were four meetings of 3 days each, 3 or 4 days each. The strongest conclusions were about things that people thought would work that the team believed couldn't work. So in a way it was warnings. You might think that you can get out this way, but you can't. For example, the first of the scenarios was called the ostrich scenario, like that bird that puts its head in the sand. And the team was saying that there may be some people in the establishment, in the then white minority government, who thought that they could just ignore the demands of the opposition, of the liberation movement, and could go on without negotiations. And the scenario team said, no, this is like an ostrich putting its head in the sand. It's only temporary. You'll have to bring your head up again, and the situation will be worse. And there were other scenarios, but not only telling stories about what could work, but equally importantly, telling stories about what can't work, or why it wouldn't work to go in this direction.
Okay, let me see if I get it right about this scenarios. Is it just like best case scenarios, worst case scenarios?
No, it's not really useful to talk about the best case where everything is perfect or the worst case where nothing works. These are not realistic. What we're looking for is stories, but stories that meet 4 very specific criteria. They have to be relevant, they have to be challenging, they have to be plausible, and they have to be clear. So they have to deal with the real issues that the country is facing, and at the same time, to be useful, they have to challenge the conventional thinking. Some of the conventional thinking in South Africa was that ignoring the opposition movement could work. The team said, no, this is not true. Similarly, there was lots of issues in the constitutional negotiations that said, let's have a new government, but it's very constrained in what it could do. And the team said, no, this can't work. This way, there is no way out if you go in this direction. So it was making clear which directions would produce which results.
What about in other countries that you have worked before? How did you apply scenario thinking into those situations?
Yeah. So the South African case was inspiring, and so we continued elsewhere, and we've done this work now in about 20 countries. We did the work in Colombia, and this was unusual in that Colombia was then, and is still to a large extent now, involved in an armed conflict between the government, several guerrilla groups, really an ongoing violence. And there the conclusion of here the team involved government ministers, senators, academics, business people, and also the guerrillas. Both of the illegal guerrilla movements participated directly in the 9 days of workshops.
How did you get the government to agree to that in the first place?
Well, it's interesting. The government agreed and in fact were willing to give the guerrillas safe passage to the workshop setting, but the guerrillas thought it would be too dangerous. And so, amazingly, they participated in 9 full days of meetings by telephone. We got permission to bring cell phones into the prison, the maximum security prison, where some of the leaders were. And one of the leaders who was in hiding in Costa Rica participated from a secret location by telephone. It was remarkable and very productive. In a way, the Colombian conclusion was the opposite of the South African conclusion. In Colombia, everybody was depressed, couldn't see any way out. It was a hopeless situation, a conflict that had been going on for decades. And the Colombian team said, actually, not only is there a way out of this, there's 3 different positive ways we could move forward. And these stories, these scenarios, these insights into how to escape from the current situation have remained 10 years later widely discussed reference points for political and intellectual and popular conversation in Colombia.
What were the 3 possible scenarios that
well,
came
there
up
was
with?
There were 4 scenarios. One said things will continue to go badly. So the first scenario was called tomorrow will come and we'll see. So meaning, you know, we'll figure tomorrow. And the team
status
argued,
quo, basically.
No, but the team said if we take that attitude, it won't be status quo. It will get worse and worse and worse. So there is no stable situation, they said. The second scenario used the phrase, in English we would say, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. In other words, that a negotiation with the guerrillas that where nobody got what they wanted would be better than no negotiation. And to have this conclusion agreed, this scenario agreed, not necessarily desirable, but plausible between the guerrillas and the government was a very important statement.
At least talk. That's the message of this scenario.
The message of this scenario is better a bad deal than no deal.
Okay.
And that was important because in that time in Colombia, the idea of negotiating with the guerrillas was completely not discussable. And there have now been lots of negotiations. The third scenario was interesting. The third scenario said the way out is with force. The way out is by crushing the opposition militarily. It was called, the scenario was called Everybody March. And in fact, the government which just finished its term, the Uribe government, to a large extent followed that model, with some people would say success, some people would say terrible consequences. The fourth scenario was, I think, the most interesting. It said that the only sustainable solution to the conflict was a citizen-led change in the country. In such a situation, simply having maps doesn't mean we agree what to do. Doesn't mean it's not a negotiation, but to say, okay, we might not agree here. The Colombians did not agree on which was the best scenario, but they said, yes, these four possibilities are all, they could happen. The first one we definitely don't want, and these other three we don't agree on, but we can talk about them. If you go to Colombia and you talk to people about Todos a Marchar, Everybody March, people know what that means. It's a map that people are familiar with. And so it's possible to have a rational national conversation about what's going on here and what might happen and what should we do.
I was about to ask that, both in Colombia and in South Africa, how did you get the public to take part in the process as well? Because you're basically inviting people of the different stakeholders to come, but then that's only a handful of people, right? What about the whole population?
Well, I think in South Africa, the team which developed the scenarios gave many workshops, maybe 100 workshops. And what was so interesting about the workshops is the team that presented the work was always a mixed team. In other words, people who you would not expect to be team members, let alone presenting together.
You mean they toured the country?
They toured the country, but in groups of 2 or 3, diverse groups of 2 or 3. So, in other words, the point I'm making is the messenger was as important as the message. To see a conservative white business person presenting work jointly with a black radical and a community worker, the audience would say, this is really something interesting. There's something is possible here that we didn't think was possible. So the messenger became as important as the message.